As you see, slope failure. I'm going to talk about slope failure as a source of wood. You'll notice that I only have my name up here. I haven't put the names of all the collaborators and the people that have helped me. But you will notice as I give the talk that all of those people, I've shamelessly stolen images and pictures out of their papers, but I've tried to cite them. So you'll see who they are as we work our way through the talk. Because I certainly haven't come up with this stuff on my own. I want to share the blame as much as I can. And there are many people who are responsible for helping me come up with this story. And that's what I'm going to tell you. It's a story today. I'm going to tell you a story about how we think slope failures bring material from upslope into streams, what it means. And you might think of this as I'm sort of presenting the current dogma. So keep that in mind. What I'm telling you is the way I think we think about slope failures as a source of wood now. But these conceptual models always change as we learn more, and we've been learning a lot about what we're learning today with all of these talks. I'm going to sort of divide, to give us a framework to work off of. I want to think about slope failures in terms of 3 points. Landslides. I'm going to call slope failures landslides primarily. They form distinct point sources of sediment and wood to channels. And those are point sources of material that might not necessarily be available to streams from the valley floor. They're bringing material from upslope down to the valley floor. So that might involve tree species and tree sizes that don't exist on the valley floor, and other things like boulders that don't exist on the valley floor. The consequences of landsliding vary systematically with position in channel network. They evolve over time. And the importance of landslide delivered wood depends on what's already in the stream and what's available in the riparian zone. So you have to keep all of those things in mind. And I'll try to show you some examples of where we came up with these ideas by, as I said, shamelessly stealing images and pictures from papers that other people have published. Although I've been a co-author on some of them, so I can't, I've helped a little bit. I'm also going to focus on debris flows. There are many landslide processes that bring things and affect stream channels. But since I've been working primarily here in Western Oregon and Washington, where debris flows are a predominant process, most of the papers I had to steal figures out of were about debris flows. Here's an image that shows debris flow tracks that were mapped after the 1996 storm by the Oregon Department of Forestry. These images show where these tracks, they mapped them as scour transitional, where they deposited, where they didn't have any stream impacts. And all I want you to see from this is that where these debris flows enter the channels are in distinct points. It doesn't affect the entire channel network. It's affecting places in very specific locations. It's affecting channels in specific locations. What debris flows do, they are typically triggered by a landslide upslope. Here's some aerial photos, I think, from a Tillamook Basin. You can see there are a number of landslides. I think these were after storms in the early 50s. The landslides often get funneled into these steep low-order channels, so you can have many sources that then get funneled into single channels. They tend to often travel all the way down to the valley floor. Not always, depositing material that they've collected on their way down into the valley. Here's another example. This one, it's a pretty confined valley. You can see there's a big pile of wood and stuff down there, and it blocked the channel, so it actually created a pond upstream. So another aspect of these debris flows and of landsliding of any type is that even though it might be, you can think of it as a point source, it has effects that extend up and downstream. So here's a little conceptual picture to describe some of those effects. A landslide, a debris flow in this case, enters the stream channel. Well, it might not enter the stream channel. It comes down, it'll deposit on the valley floor. It might, some portion of it might hit the stream channel. It might bring some sediment into the stream, bring some wood into the stream, and it has a variety of effects. You can see that it might bury a portion of the stream. It can cause aggradation. It's bringing in some wood, but because it's also affected the stream in other ways, it can cause the stream to erode its banks, to avulse, so that it might also cause the recruitment of local trees from upstream and downstream. So the effects of a debris flow can be hard to discern, or you've got a variety of effects. We've got things where it buries the channel directly, but then there are responses of the channel to what the debris flow did to it that you might also want to keep in mind. Those are also impacts that landslides have on the channels. Okay, we were just looking at what happens when you think about a single site, a single debris flow coming down and entering a channel. When we look at basins typical of the Coast Range and of basins in the coastal and Cascade ranges of Washington, we see many, many sites. When you move far upstream, we have a lot of sites. The streams might not be strong enough or large enough to actually move that material away, and we actually get valley fill deposits that just fill up the valleys. As you move further downstream, the streams are able to slowly erode material away, but they still build fans. And you can see here we have dots that just show, this is from a small basin in the, it was from that paper, it was in the Umpqua Basin. And there are a whole series of debris flow fans that were mapped on these channels. And think about the conceptual model we had where you've got a debris flow that comes in. Here's some data that's, we've measured the amount of wood, just counting pieces in this case, and plotted them up here as a function of distance from the fan. So you can think of the fan, we didn't distinguish in this particular graph between upstream and downstream, just distance from the nearest fan, but you can see that the largest number, where we see the greatest abundance of wood, is near the fan, and when you get away from a fan, that number tends to drop off. So you can imagine, you can think about it, we've got all of these different points of input with some effect that extends up and downstream. A fairly large proportion of the channel might actually be affected by these inputs from upslope. Here we've plotted out the extent of the fans, so you can actually see where the channel is affected by debris flow impacts, what proportion of the channel is affected. And you can imagine that proportion is going to depend on how big these fans are, how far apart the tributaries that are producing them are spaced. And what we find, here's a plot from the Sayusla from the Sayusla Basin. It's looking at two different river segments where we just plotted up the distance between tributaries. And you can see that as you move to larger drainage areas, as you move downstream through these river segments, the spacing between tributaries, so the spacing between these effects that these debris flows have had on the channels gets larger and larger. Tributary spacing increases as we move downstream. So you can imagine, as you go to larger and larger rivers, the proportion of the area, the proportion of the channel length that's affected by these types of landslide effects becomes smaller and smaller. So the importance of these effects depends on where you are in the channel network and on the topography, on the basin topography. So let's think about a bit about what a debris flow is actually going to bring into the channel. And we know quite a bit about that because a lot of folks have looked at what's coming in. Here is an example of some work that Christine May did, just looking at what was filling up these small channels that the debris flows are running through as they scour down and then deposit on the valley floor. And she looked at the amount of sediment and wood that was contained in these channels as a function of time since the last debris flow. And she estimated that time using dendrochronology of the trees that were growing along the debris flow track. And what you found, if you look at that plot upstream, the time since the last debris flow, and look at the volume of wood that is collecting in these small little headwater streams, the first and second order channels up on the steep hill slopes, over time the amount of wood that's collected increases. So there's a little schematic down there to illustrate what she found. Immediately after a debris flow occurs, the channels are often scoured to bedrock. Over time, they gradually collect a few trees. Stuff starts to stick. The more that's there, the more retentive they become. Little landslides come in from the sides and introduce material that just sticks there. And then eventually we have a landslide that's large enough to evolve into a debris flow, or happens during a storm and there's enough water. Conditions are just right to create a debris flow, and that material then gets scoured down again, and we start the whole cycle. So we can think about what's available in these channels in terms of how long it's been since the last debris flow, how long they are, how far it is down to where the debris flow will stop. And then we can put all this together. We can take tree fall models, stand growth models, take a model like Mark was just describing earlier, and actually apply it to these small streams and estimate how much wood would be available. Now this is, again, a modeling exercise, but it's one that helps us to discern just where debris flow, or where landslide delivered wood is coming from, where it's ending up, how long it takes to accumulate it. This is a model that we put together that incorporated stand growth models. This one was done using Organon, in fact. Incorporated upslope stand management, used a tree fault model to estimate how much wood would be in these small debris flow prone channels. Used a storm sequence model to estimate how often we would have conditions conducive to debris flows. Ran the material down using empirical models for landslide initiation and debris flow runout, and then just kept track of where all of the wood ended up. And you can see we estimated what the recruitment rate, where wood that's provided by debris flows to the channels is coming from in terms of a rate of number of pieces per year, and where that ended up in the stream channels. And as we described earlier, it's very spotty. Debris flows deliver material to streams in very particular locations. Now that was a rather complicated way of thinking about it, coupling all of those different models. A few years ago, Kelly Burnett and I tried to come up with a simpler way. We can, just thinking about where the initiation sites are, where these small channels that debris flows run out are, we can empirically identify the locations where there's a potential for recruitment of wood from upslope to whatever channels you're interested in, looking solely just at what the source areas are. The source areas for landslide initiation in this case, and the source areas for wood that's accumulated in these small debris flow prone channels. And we came up with a way to map this out in terms of the proportion of events. We can identify empirically where we think a given proportion of the debris flow events are going to be initiated from, which channels are going to traverse on their way to a fish-bearing channel, and then rank those in terms of the most frequent occurrences to the least frequent occurrences. In this case, we've simply ranked them. We've got 33% in the high rank zones, the red ones, 33% in the yellow ones, 33% in the low ones, and the last 1% in the very low ones. And here we were looking solely at debris flows that we think could deliver to the coho-bearing streams that are delineated by those black lines. This is in a portion of the North Fork of the Siuslaw River. So we've been thinking now about where debris flows occur, where the source areas are, where they end up in the channels. But once a debris flow deposit is put there, it changes over time. You can imagine slowly, depending on how big the deposit is, how big the stream is, the stuff that's deposited in the channel gets moved downstream. The logs that are deposited, they rot away. So over time, the effects of the debris flow die off. Here's some data over on the left, or no, the right side there. These are from a study that Lee Bend and others did in the Olympic Peninsula, just looking at the amount of wood associated with debris flow deposits and the number of deep pools associated with them, and how those numbers related to the age of the deposit based, again, on dendrochronology. And of course, we have fewer samples at older ages. These are harder to find, they get covered up, but the highest wood counts, the highest pool counts tended to occur on the youngest deposits, and on the older deposits, the wood counts and the pool counts tended to be more like they were in areas that hadn't been affected by debris flows. So you can think then about what the recurrence interval of a debris flow is relative to how long it takes these changes to occur, how long it takes it to evolve from something that's got some newly delivered wood, changes to the channel. As the channel evolves back to a more, we call it, think of it as an older state. This graph over here shows what proportion of time a debris flow deposit might be in different age classes. So most of the time it's old if the recurrence interval is fairly long. Then we can think about how that proportion changes, or what the proportion of ages are for sites within an entire basin. Now what that was looking at is, on average, it's going to look like this graph on the left. But if we have a long period without much happening, without any big storms, we end up with a predominance of older sites. If we look in a basin after a series of storms, we end up with the predominance of young sites. That is going to affect the types of habitats, the amount of wood, what it is that we find in the basin. So we need to think about both the density of sites, spatially, how many debris flow sites there are, and what age class they all lie at. Now here's a graph, a map that's showing landslides, in this case debris flows in the Cascades, the Oregon Cascades after the 1996 storms. They tend to be concentrated in space. You might have large areas that don't have a lot of events, and then a whole bunch of events in one small area. When you zoom into that area, you'll notice that those debris flows events then appear to be sort of randomly positioned. So we have sort of a non-random location concentrated in space at one scale, something of a more random location at another scale. That sort of brings into play this idea of a disturbance regime. The spatial scale over which disturbances are occurring, the magnitude of those disturbances, and the frequency of those disturbances. And we think about that often in terms of vegetation disturbances, but you can apply the same ideas now to aquatic habitats. And those are going to depend, that disturbance regime is something that depends on the topography, the spacing of these events in space and time, network structure. Now I've been talking a lot about debris flow effects in a certain part of the network. When you move downstream a little bit, the stream has sufficient power to actually move all that wood. I see you're going to want me to stop shortly. Bigger things happen. You can develop debris-laden floods, dam break floods, migrating organic dams. On that picture on the upper right there, you'll see what that stuff that's on the lower right did as it moved through that channel following a debris flow. The channel, the stream was able to move all that material, and it pretty much destroyed all of the riparian vegetation for several kilometers downstream. Now, here's something that Oregon Department of Forestry in the Wilson watershed analysis came up with. We were able to come up with ways of assessing the debris flow, the likely debris flow impacts in terms of the stream power. We could think of where we're going to have these colluvial deposits that don't have a huge amount of effect. We're just collecting material. Where you have these deposits that tend to stick around and evolve through time. Where you have these debris-laden floods, and even further downstream where debris flows really don't seem to have much effect at all. We can map out basins in terms of these different effects. It doesn't mean that's exactly where they're all going to occur, but it helps us to anticipate what the different effects are going to be, where they're going to occur, and then to think about what different riparian and upslope management, if you are managing to try to reduce the risk of debris-laden floods. Those are things to keep in mind as you're thinking about what sort of density and size distribution you want to encourage, you want to aim for in the riparian zones and the upslope zones. How important is the debris flow wood? It depends where you look. Here are studies that have tried to divide up wood sources between different processes. Bank erosion, just tree fall from riparian mortality, that coming from landslides. And you see it's all over the place. Some places we have no landslide wood, other places we have lots. Here's another set of studies. That previous one was from Northern California. These are from a series of small basins in the Umpqua Basin. Again, these are all in that portion of the network where we collect debris flow deposits, but we see that the proportion of wood from debris flows varies dramatically. Here's the results of a simulation model. This is looking at a variety of different sources: natural mortality, fire-killed, snagfall, bank erosion, and you'll see that these results show that we anticipate that where these different processes are providing wood varies quite a bit about where you look in the channel network. So it's not surprising that we find our studies each show that the importance of the debris flow wood, its relative abundance, is quite variable. We can try to model that. This is a result of a model looking at comparing riparian sources of wood to upslope sources of wood for the Nehalem and the Wilson River Basin. This is looking at 50 years out in a simulation. And looking at the black lines, their thickness is correlated to how many key pieces were collected over the past 50 years, accumulated in these streams. The red shows the wood that was accumulated from upslope. It's quite variable. It's dependent upon the topography, where you have upslope sources. It's dependent upon what the riparian sources were in each of these locations and what the upslope sources of wood were in each of these locations. It's only a model, but it gives us some insights as to how these things might work. We can map out all of those things. So all of these points, all of these parts, these factors of how upslope inputs affect wood in the stream, I think we have the data and we have the means of characterizing them. We just have to do it.